He said he was too tired to come home after work. Then our child asked why he was sleeping at another woman's place again. By the time Evan started saying he was too tired to come home after work, the explanation fit easily into the shape of their lives, because exhaustion had become a shared language between him and Mara over the past few years, shaped by long hours, childcare logistics, and the quiet understanding that adulthood rarely left room for rest. They were not married, but they had been together long enough that the difference felt mostly administrative, sharing a rented townhouse on the edge of the city, splitting bills, raising their 6-year-old son Liam, and talking loosely about buying a place someday once things felt more stable. Evan worked in operations for a logistics company, a job that came with unpredictable schedules and sudden overtime, while Mara managed accounts for a small firm and structured her days around school pickups and the fragile balance of deadlines and dinner times. At first, Evan's absences came with advance notice. Texts sent late afternoon explaining that a shipment issue or staffing gap meant another overnight shift, and Mara adjusted without complaint, reheating leftovers, setting aside his portion, and telling Liam that his dad would be home in the morning. Over time, those explanations became shorter, sometimes arriving after midnight, sometimes not at all, and Evan stopped apologizing in the careful way he used to, sounding instead like someone stating a fact he expected to be accepted. Mara noticed the change without naming it. The way he began showering at work more often, the faint unfamiliar detergent smell on his clothes, the way his phone stayed face down on the counter when he did come home. But none of it rose to the level of accusation, because there was no single moment that demanded one. Liam, however, reacted differently, responding not to patterns but to disruptions, asking why his dad missed another school morning or why bedtime stories were read by video call instead of in person. And Mara answered with rehearsed calm, explaining work emergencies in terms a child could understand. One evening, Evan came by the house briefly before leaving again, moving through the rooms like a visitor rather than someone returning home, grabbing clean clothes and avoiding eye contact. And when Liam asked if he would be back for breakfast, Evan hesitated just long enough for Mara to notice before saying probably not, kissing the top of his son's head and leaving without dinner. That pause stayed with Mara after the door closed, lingering in the quiet kitchen as she packed Evan's forgotten lunch into the fridge and tried to tell herself that stress explained everything. The following weekend, Evan promised to take Liam to the park, but canceled an hour before, saying he had not slept and needed to recover. And Mara watched Liam accept the disappointment with a practiced shrug that felt too adult for his age. Later that night, while folding laundry, Mara found that Evan's work bag contained items he did not usually carry home: a spare phone charger she did not recognize, a receipt from a convenience store across town timestamped well after midnight. And though none of it proved anything, it shifted something in her understanding, introducing the possibility that exhaustion was not the full story. She placed the items back carefully, aware of how deliberate that action felt, and went to bed alone, listening to the quiet house and noting how familiar that solitude had become. The next afternoon, as Mara picked Liam up from school, he talked about his day in fragments, then asked casually why Dad sometimes slept at the other lady's house when he worked late. The question delivered without drama, as if it were already a known fact. Mara felt the moment stretch, her response delayed by the need to confirm that she had heard him correctly. And when she asked what he meant, Liam explained that Dad had told him once that it was easier to stay there because it was closer to work, adding that the lady had a dog that barked at night. Mara managed to keep her voice steady as she nodded and changed the subject, but inside, the explanations Evan had given her over months rearranged themselves into a new order that made a different kind of sense, one she could no longer ignore. After that conversation, Mara did not confront Evan immediately, partly because she needed to understand what she now knew and partly because the knowledge itself felt fragile, like something that could shatter if handled too quickly. She moved through the following days with a heightened awareness, noticing details she might once have dismissed. The way Evan's schedule changed without warning, the inconsistency in his stories about which coworkers were covering which shifts, and the fact that he had started referring to his workplace in vague terms, as if specifics might trap him. When Evan did come home, he stayed detached, engaging with Liam in short bursts of attention that felt rehearsed. then retreating into his phone or falling asleep on the couch fully dressed, shoes by the door as if ready to leave again at any moment. Mara began to test the edges of his explanations without revealing her suspicion, asking casual questions about work logistics, commute times, and who else was on overnight rotation. And each answer arrived smoothly but lacked the grounded detail of truth, shifting slightly from one retelling to the next. Liam, unaware of the significance of his earlier comment, continued to point out changes in routine with the blunt honesty of a child, mentioning that Dad's bag sometimes smelled like a dog or that he had seen the same woman's car in a parking lot near the office building when Evan picked him up once. Observations offered without accusation but landing heavily nonetheless. Mara responded with careful neutrality, but those remarks began to form a shape she could not unsee, especially when combined with the way Evan now avoided being photographed together at school events or family gatherings, stepping aside just before pictures were taken or claiming he needed to make a call. One evening, Mara checked their shared calendar to confirm a school meeting and noticed that Evan had stopped syncing his schedule weeks earlier, a small technical change that felt deliberate once she saw it. And when she asked about it later, he brushed it off as a phone update glitch and changed the subject. The first time Mara drove past Evan's workplace late at night, telling herself it was coincidence because she had errands nearby, she noticed his car was not there, despite his earlier message claiming a long shift, and the absence left her with a quiet, steady dread rather than shock. She resisted the urge to follow that feeling immediately, choosing instead to observe, to let patterns emerge fully rather than confront fragments. And in doing so, she began to document what she saw, saving screenshots of his messages, noting dates and times, and keeping receipts she found in his pockets instead of returning them. When Evan claimed exhaustion as a reason to skip Liam's parent night at school, Mara attended alone, listening as other parents discussed routines that assumed presence and reliability. And she felt the growing gap between the life she was presenting and the one she was living. The tension finally surfaced in small, practical conflicts, arguments about missed bills, forgotten groceries, and whose turn it was to handle bedtime. Disagreements that seemed ordinary on the surface but carried an undercurrent of mistrust that neither of them addressed directly. Evan grew defensive more quickly, reacting to neutral comments as if they were accusations, and Mara noticed how often he framed himself as overwhelmed and misunderstood, positioning exhaustion as both shield and justification. One night, as Evan prepared to leave again, Liam asked whether he would be staying with the dog lady or coming home this time, and Evan's response came too quickly, too sharply, telling him not to talk about things he did not understand, a reaction that left Liam silent and watchful. Mara said nothing in the moment, but the way Evan avoided her eyes as he left confirmed that the story she was piecing together was no longer speculation, and she began to consider not just whether cheating was happening, but how long it had been woven into their lives without her consent. By the time Mara moved from observation to confirmation, the shift felt less like a decision and more like a narrowing of options, because the evidence she had been collecting no longer left room for alternative explanations. The opportunity came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Evan came by the house unexpectedly to shower and change before leaving again, explaining that he had spilled something at work, and the casualness of his arrival created a brief window where his guard seemed lowered. While Evan was in the bathroom, his phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, the screen lighting up with a notification preview that showed a name Mara did not recognize and a message fragment referencing last night and staying over again. She did not touch the phone, but the words alone were enough to solidify what had been forming in her mind, because they matched it closely with what Liam had described for coincidence. When Evan emerged, dressed in clean clothes and already reaching for his keys, Mara asked him to sit for a moment, framing it as a practical conversation about schedules and Liam's school commitments. And Evan complied with visible impatience, glancing at his phone repeatedly as if measuring the delay. Mara spoke carefully, grounding herself in specifics rather than accusation, mentioning the missed events, the inconsistencies in his work hours, and Liam's confusion about where his father slept. And with each detail, Evan's posture shifted, his responses tightening as he denied wrongdoing while avoiding the actual questions being asked. The The conversation stalled in that familiar space where explanations were offered without substance, and Mara realized that waiting for honesty was no longer productive because Evan's priority was clearly maintaining control of the narrative rather than repairing trust. That evening, after Evan left again, Mara made a deliberate choice to follow the pattern rather than confront it, waiting until Liam was asleep and then driving toward the area Evan claimed housed his workplace satellite office, her hands steady on the wheel despite the tension building in her chest. She did not see Evan's car there, but after circling once, she noticed it parked several blocks away near a small apartment complex. Positioned with the familiarity of someone who had done this before, Mara did not approach the building, choosing instead to sit in her car and observe the details that confirmed routine rather than impulse. The way lights turned on in a second-floor unit shortly after Evan arrived, the presence of a dog barking briefly before settling, and the sense that she was witnessing something well-established rather than newly formed. She left without confrontation, because the proof she needed was no longer visual but contextual, the alignment of timing, location, and behavior forming a complete picture that no denial could dismantle. The next day, Mara accessed their shared cloud storage to retrieve a document for work and noticed a folder she did not recognize, its contents consisting of screenshots Evan had taken of schedules, messages, and travel routes, likely meant for coordination rather than secrecy. And though she did not open anything unrelated to her account access, the existence of the folder alone indicated a parallel life organized with care. When Evan returned late that night, Mara confronted him not with anger, but with clarity, stating what she knew, where she had been, and how Liam's comments fit into the reality Evan had been avoiding. And for the first time, Evan did not immediately deny it. His silence stretched long enough to serve as confirmation, followed by a partial admission framed around convenience, stress, and the idea that things had simply gotten complicated, explanations that focused on circumstances rather than responsibility. Mara listened without interruption, noticing how Evan avoided mentioning Liam entirely. And when she asked how long it had been happening, Evan's answer was vague, measured in months rather than dates, signaling both duration and reluctance to fully disclose. The conversation ended without resolution, because Evan left again, claiming he needed time to think, and Mara was left with the certainty that the cheating was not an isolated failure but a sustained choice that had already altered their family in ways she was only beginning to understand. The days following that admission unfolded with a strained formality that made every interaction feel provisional, as if their shared life had been reduced to logistics while the deeper questions remained suspended. Evan stayed away more openly now, no longer bothering to frame his absences as emergencies. And when he did come by the house, it was to collect items he claimed he needed for work, though Mara noticed he was gradually removing personal belongings rather than essentials. Mara focused on maintaining routine for Liam, keeping school mornings consistent and evenings predictable. But the tension seeped through in quieter ways, in how Liam watched adults more closely and hesitated before asking questions that once came easily. Evan's family became aware of the situation through fragmented explanations he offered them, emphasizing exhaustion, mutual distance, and the idea that things had simply grown complicated. And within days, Mara began receiving messages that carried a careful neutrality, checking on her while subtly implying that responsibility was shared. The pressure to be reasonable, to avoid conflict, and to keep matters private settled in quickly, reinforced by Evan's insistence that public acknowledgement would only harm Liam and complicate custody discussions that he began referencing without elaboration. When Mara asked what he meant by that, Evan spoke in practical terms about living arrangements, school zoning, and finances, positioning the conversation as a necessary adjustment rather than a consequence of betrayal. And the calmness with which he did so revealed a level of preparation that felt unsettling. Mara consulted a family law attorney not because she wanted immediate separation, but because the introduction of legal language had shifted the stakes, and she needed to understand her position before decisions were made for her. The consultation clarified issues she had not fully considered, including how Evan's absence, financial contributions, and informal living arrangements might be interpreted if disputes escalated. And the information reframed Evan's recent behavior as strategic rather than reactive. When Mara asked Evan to discuss boundaries regarding Liam, specifically where he stayed and who he was exposed to. Evan resisted, framing the request as controlling and unnecessary. And for the first time, Morris saw how quickly he reframed accountability as restriction when it suited him. Liam's teacher requested a meeting to discuss changes in his behavior, noting increased distraction and occasional withdrawal during group activities. And Mara attended alone, aware that Evan had been informed but chose not to come. That absence carried weight beyond logistics, reinforcing the reality that the cheating had already extended its impact into spaces Evan no longer prioritized. At a family gathering Evan attended without Mara, word traveled back through mutual acquaintances that he appeared lighter, more relaxed, and openly accompanied by someone new. A detail delivered gently but with unmistakable clarity. Mara did not confront him about that immediately, but when Evan later accused her of making things difficult by asking for structure and transparency, she pointed out that his actions had already made their situation public without her consent. The argument that followed did not escalate in volume but in precision, with Mara referencing specific dates, missed responsibilities, and the emotional strain placed on Liam, and Evan responding by minimizing the timeline and reframing the cheating as an outcome of a relationship that had already deteriorated. That reframing marked a turning point, because it confirmed that Evan was no longer seeking repair, but justification. And Mara understood that any resolution would require accepting that the partnership she thought they shared no longer existed in the way she needed it to. As the situation moved toward resolution, the pace shifted from emotional negotiation to concrete decision-making, driven less by confrontation and more by necessity. Because continuing without structure had begun to cost Mara and Liam stability, they could no longer afford to lose. Mara formalized custody arrangements through her attorney, not to punish Evan but to protect Liam from the unpredictability that had become routine. And when Evan was served with paperwork outlining temporary schedules and financial responsibilities, his reaction revealed how thoroughly he had underestimated the consequences of his choices. He pushed back at first, arguing that legal involvement was excessive and damaging, but the documentation of his absences, inconsistent contributions, and admitted living arrangements left little room for reinterpretation, and the discussion shifted from what felt fair to what could be supported. Evan's family, initially inclined to mediate, became more reserved as details emerged, their support cooling into quiet distance as the situation clarified itself beyond narrative spin. The woman Evan had been staying with faded from relevance, not through drama, but through exposure, because once secrecy was removed, the arrangement lost its momentum and practicality, and Evan found himself navigating the fallout without the insulation he had relied on. Liam adjusted slowly to a new routine that prioritized consistency, spending scheduled time with Evan in settings that did not blur boundaries. And while the questions did not disappear, they became easier to answer honestly without offering explanations that required erasure or denial. The final hearing concluded without spectacle, establishing custody terms and financial responsibilities that reflected reality rather than intention. And Mara left with a sense of grounded relief rather than victory, aware that closure often arrived quietly rather than triumphantly. Evan attended fewer shared events afterward, his presence recalibrated into defined roles rather than assumed access, and over time, his attempts to renegotiate through emotional appeals diminished as the structure held. Months later, Mara noticed a subtle but meaningful change in her household: the return of predictability, the absence of constant vigilance, and the way Liam's behavior stabilized once explanations matched experience. The cheating had not ended their relationship in a single moment, but its consequences had reshaped it decisively, forcing choices that restored honesty not through reconciliation but through boundaries. And while the future remained complex, it was no longer built on omissions that demanded silence to survive,